Hey, thanks for joining us today. Dave Hakeem here, Director of the Midwest Academy. Today's video comes to you from our Firearms-Combatives Program, and it deals with a question we get a lot in the program, which is on post-contact scanning, kind of the how, when, and why we do that. Before we get started today, let's ensure that you have a safe training environment by making sure you've removed all live rounds from the training area and that you have cleared out your weapon. In order to do that, make sure that you've removed the source, check the chamber, press check, and then you're ready to begin. So what we're going to talk about is a fairly complex subject, and we'll try to keep to the very basic points for this training video. So the first thing we want to talk about is why it is you would start shooting. And obviously that's because there's a deadly force threat and you feel the need to protect your life or somebody else's life. The next question to really answer is, how do we know there's a deadly force threat? Well, we get that sensory input through our eyes primarily. So by getting that data through our eyes, that sensory information through our eyes, what that tells us is that shooting is primarily, even though it's a physical skill, it's primarily visually driven. And that visual stimulus and the decision-making process and the physical mechanics are all linked. The easiest way to think about this is in terms of sight pictures. So we have basically what we can call stress sight picture or target focus sight picture or threat focus sight picture on one side, and a hard sight focused or a clear front sight focused sight picture on the other side. I'm going to use this bob here as my threat area, and so what I said just means to you is that under stress, when I produce my weapon, one of two things can happen. My eyes can either go and focus on the threat, and in which case when I punch out, my sights will be not crisp in my vision, or my eyes can go from the threat to the front sight, and then my threat will be blurry in the background. One of the limitations of the human eye is that it can only focus on one thing at a time. So what that basically means is if I'm looking at my threat and my threat is crisp and clear, generally what we would consider good vision, that my sights are generally going to be somewhat blurry. Or if I get a crisp focus on my front sight, my threat is going to be somewhat blurry. So just to recap, what we've discussed so far is how I know to start shooting is I see my threat area, deadly force threat is produced through my training and practice, my weapon is produced, and now my mechanics go to one of two sight focuses, sight pictures, and eye focus, depending on a number of factors, including my training, my skill level, the range, lighting, etc. The focus of my eyes and the sight picture that ends up getting used is going to determine a significant amount of what happens next. So let's say I'm using a hard sight focus. So imagine this threat's much further away, and I need a more clear sight picture in order to make that shot. I'm on target. Remember, just from our classes, the only time that the weapon presses out of the workspace is to make those shots. So as soon as I start driving out to the target, I start getting that friction leverage on the grip, I start slacking out the trigger, and right here I'm crisping up the front sight and the target's getting blurry in the background. Okay, and that's going to be basically how I'm shooting. Now, why that's important in this discussion is it's important to understand that when I am shooting, what I'm focusing on the front sight, and we've already said that the human eye can only focus on one thing at a time. So the next question becomes, how do I know when to stop shooting? Well, a number of factors go into that. If we think about the mechanics of what's happening, I'm focused on the front sight. Every round I break, there's some recoil to the weapon. The better skilled I am, the flatter it stays, the more I'm able to stay on that front sight. If I'm not as good at keeping the weapon flat, I'm going to get more up and down, and it's going to take longer to get back on the sight. The longer it takes to get on the sight, the more time there is for this environment here to change. Okay, so what that basically means is if I can run the gun hard, fast, and flat, any changes that the bad guy's making, any incremental changes, left, right, up, down, any kind of movement, I'm probably tracking him and staying on him basically through that subconscious relationship of hand-eye coordination. However, the more time there is, the more break in that gap, the longer it takes me to get back on the site, the more things have changed down on this end, and I've fallen a little bit behind the OODA loop with those shots. So what could happen is I end up in a position where I'm back on the site, but the thing I was shooting at, what was blurry in the background, isn't necessarily there anymore. And that gets us into today's discussion about scanning. At the very basic level, any combat shooting program should basically be teaching a follow-through sight picture. What that basically means is that 1 shot is 2 sight pictures, 5 shots is 6 sight pictures, 22 shots is 23 sight pictures. What you're doing is with that additional sight pictures, you are checking your work through your sights. So let's say I've fired however many shots and I get that additional sight picture, I'm checking my work through my sights, and the thing I was shooting at is no longer there. I'm obviously not going to keep shooting. That answers our question of how do we know when to stop shooting? Well, when the threat isn't in my follow-through sight picture, I'm not going to keep shooting. Otherwise, what am I shooting at? Doesn't mean the threat is down, though. The threat could have moved laterally on me, left or right, could have moved behind cover, could be down. So this is when we start our scan. And the basics of scanning is I want to get the weapon out of my visual plane. As long as the weapon is out in my visual plane, my eyes are going to tend to track to the weapon, plus anything that's below the line of sight of my weapon, I'm not going to be able to see. So what we teach to do is bring the weapon into your workspace. We keep our finger on the trigger at this point. The trigger is still prepped. And at this point, we do a very short immediate area scan, left, right. If it's worth looking at with our head, it's worth tracking with our weapon. Okay? Now, the reason we do that short scan is because if the target had made a lateral movement, I don't want to come all the way down and come all the way up, or come all the way in and come all the way out, because, again, that's time. And deadly force situation is a time is life scenario. So, again, we break the weapon down, the trigger would stay prepped, and here I might drive my head left or right, identify the additional threat, drive the gun to that threat, and resume work. If the threat wasn't in that immediate scan left to right, I'm going to track the weapon down. Right? I'm going to track the weapon and my eyes down. As that happens, I open up my visual field more, and if the threat has fallen to the ground, I'm going to identify him over there. Once the threat's been identified, bring the weapon into my workspace, I'm going to scan left, scan right, and then prepare to move. So why am I going to scan over my shoulders before I move? Well, gunfire attracts good guys and bad guys, unfortunately. So I want to make sure that I don't step off my platform and catch a round from a good guy who's coming around the corner and might see the threat on the ground, might see him moving or something like that, and be looking to get in that gunfight and service the threat. So once again, our basic scan that we teach is that once I've made that last hit and I get that follow-through sight picture and there's no threat, I bring the weapon in, but I stay on the trigger. Left, right. No additional work, down to the ground. There's my bad guy. Bring the weapon into the workspace, finger off the trigger, look left, look right, it's clear to move, and then prepare to move. We'll give you one final illustration of how this works with lateral movement. I've set up these 3 bobs here, but what they represent is basically a single threat that's moving either left or right on me. So I'll talk you through kind of the thought process and the mechanics of how this works. And I'm going to stay fairly close so that the camera can still pick up what I'm saying. So let's say this first bob is my initial threat area, and I've produced my weapon and I'm servicing that threat. I get a last follow-through sight picture, but he's no longer here in this area. So that what I do is I stay on the trigger, I bring the weapon slightly in, and as I scan, maybe I turned and I picked him up over here. He had moved to this area. So I turn my head, pick him up, drive the weapon, and I'm working him over here. Now let's say I get a follow-through sight picture, but he's not there anymore. Let's say somehow he moved all the way to here. Well, what's going to happen is I'm going to bring the weapon in, I see that movement, I drive the weapon all the way across, and I drive more rounds on the target over here. Okay, one final example. My threat area is down here. I fired my last shot, the weapon cycles, I get my follow-through sight picture, and there's no threat behind my sight picture. So I bring the weapon in, finger on the trigger, scan left, scan right. I see no work. Track the target to the ground. I see my bad guy, doesn't need any more servicing. Bring the weapon in, scan left, scan right over my shoulder, ready to move. Okay, one additional thought. The idea of scanning left, scanning right, and then coming down is something that might be dependent on your shooting skill level. Remember we talked about at the beginning of this video about how hard, fast, and flat you can run the gun. So if I could run the gun fairly flat and stay ahead in the OODA loop as far as my sights and my hand-eye coordination goes, then those incremental movements to the ground that he's making, I'll probably be tracking him. And at the end of me shooting him and staying on top of him, I'll probably have shot him to this position. And then that basically changes the way that the scan sequences, because in that case, we basically shot all the way to the ground, and now we bring the weapon to the workspace, scan left, scan right, because obviously he hasn't moved laterally on me. Okay? So again, it's a thinking person's arena. Hey, thanks for tuning in today. We hope you got something out of this little scanning video. There's only so much knowledge we can pass on in a format like this. But if you like this video, subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and better yet, come to one of our classes. If you have any questions on this video, feel free to comment or reach out to us on our through our website at www.themidwestacademy.com. Have a great day.